there are any things we need to adjust at all.
Yeah.
I think for most people, you're probably best known for your work at the BBC and in more recent decades for ALL, which everybody would acknowledge you made a massive contribution. But there's much more to Steven Fawkes than those two things, as I do know. So we want to explore some of those other strands. Some things may emerge from our curiosity about you. Others may emerge because that's the way you take the conversation. So it's quite informal, really. So John and I will roughly alternate, but I'll ask John to start with the biographical. In other words, how you became a languages person. Over to you, John.
So, Stephen, hello. I'm John.
Nice to meet you.
I'm delighted to meet you. And the biographical thing is really interesting because people become language teachers and then professionals and get involved in different ways. So, if you could tell us a little bit how that happened for you.
Yes. So I started off like most people in my language learning in secondary school. But there was a bit of background before that I'll tell you about in just a moment. So I went to grammar school, a small grammar school in Leamington Spa, where we were only a 3-form entry, and where they allowed you to have a very unbalanced curriculum. And then in what was then called the third year and is now year 9, I moved to another grammar school, a little bit bigger in Wolverhampton, where I was allowed to continue with my very unbalanced curriculum. So at age 11, everyone at Leamington did French for the first year. And then in the second year, if you were good at French, you could opt to do Latin as your second language, which meant that you wouldn't take metalwork. So I was very happy not to take metalwork, so I took Latin. And then in the third year, if you were good at Latin as well as French, you were allowed to take German, in which case you dropped woodwork, at which I was a dangerous person. I was a chisel handler of no great, lack of skill. So by the time I moved to Wolverhampton in year 9, as we'd say nowadays, I was doing those French, German, and Latin. And then in the fourth year, we had a very enthusiastic head of languages. He wanted to open up the possibility of doing Russian O-level, as it was called then, now called the GCSE, of course. So we did that in 2 years. In the fourth and fifth year, we did a 2-year O-level course. And for that, I had to give up an hour of sport a week. And as there were 2 hours of sport, I thought that was probably fine. Physically speaking, losing 1 hour at a sport in which I was no good anyway was not a problem. So I was allowed to do that unbalanced curriculum all the way through to the O-level, which ended up obviously with nearly all of my subjects being a language. So 2 times English, French, German, Latin, Russian, and then 2 times maths and physics. And that was my curriculum.
Wow. Yes. I like the way you managed to avoid the woodwork and things. There are people who never got beyond making a bookshelf, that kind of stuff.
I was just a book stand, but it looked more like a turnip. Actually, it had no shape to it whatsoever.
Right. I think that's a very encouraging account. And so then you went to university.
Yes. So when I was making choices about university, my school was encouraging me to think about Oxbridge entrance because they thought I would enjoy it and be able to cope with the additional study and so on. And I was quite taken with that idea because of the historical nature of those 2 universities. I was drawn to Gothic things and historical things. But I was also drawn to the courses they were offering in some of the more modern, I suppose you'd say, universities. I remember going to Leeds for interview and thinking they were very good, partly because I had been there for their Russian course that they put on every Easter holiday for 6th formers, and I thought they were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And I also went down to, one of the London universities, and I went to Sussex as well, which is a very different sort of course, but they all looked interesting. Anyway, I ended up succeeding in my entrance exam, and so I went to Cambridge, which was not by any means a modern course.
Okay. And So you succeeded at Cambridge, and did you actually enjoy the course in the end, or did you find it?
So that's a very interesting question. So, I mean, I've worked hard at my schoolwork and enjoyed my schoolwork. So I enjoyed the course to that extent. But the things I enjoyed doing most were the ones actually that took me into a broader sphere. So in part 2 of the Tripos at Cambridge, you were allowed to pick the papers you wanted to do, and you can pick them from more than one discipline. So most of my papers were in languages still, but there was one which was called tragedy, and which encompassed obviously the tragedy, like the 17th century tragedies of France,
Yeah.
the tragedies in Germany and so on, and in Russia, but also the ancient Greek tragedies and Shakespeare and others from all over the world. So that was, and I worked there with someone I would never have met otherwise, who was really an English lecturer, who was absolutely brilliant as a supervisor and opened up my mind to thinking about things in very many different ways.
Right. Okay. Absolutely fascinating. Probably next, it's a question of going on to schools you first taught in,
Yeah.
and I think you went to County Durham, didn't you?
That's right. I was just going to tell you this story from my earlier childhood, which would be probably my first encounter with another language. And this was because I was a very avid reader, even as a young child. And one summer holiday, I had read everything in the house. I mean, literally everything that my parents would let me open, I had read. And the only thing I was left with was, if you can imagine this, the Daily Express annual from about 1945 that my parents had kept for some reason. It had nothing of interest in it until I came to the very inside back cover, where there was music. There was written music, which I couldn't read, obviously.
Yeah.
And also there were words, and these words meant nothing to me. And I was a competent reader. This would be about age 8 or 9. And I couldn't understand why none of these words made sense to me. So I asked my mum, and she told me that it was a song in French, and she sang it to me. And I was just, I was hypnotized. I couldn't understand where these sounds were coming from my mother. It didn't sound like what she normally talked like. The words didn't look or sound like any words I knew. And this was when she said, well, French is a language they speak in other countries, including France, which is just across the channel. And I was just sold on this. This was just an amazing idea. I remember walking to school. When we went back to school, I remember dragging my fingers along the garden walls all the way to school, which is only at the end of the road, and making up these words that I thought sounded like this language that my mum had been singing to me. And that was me. I was hooked on languages, really.
That's a great breakthrough moment and unusual, very
Yeah.
individual. And the fact you remember all the details about
Yeah.
and walking to school,
Yeah.
making up your own, I think that's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I come in for a moment, John?
Yes, Alan, it's your turn.
Stephen, when you were talking about your ultra narrow curriculum, which sounds like even more narrow than the one I was unfortunate enough to experience, the creative side was totally missing, and I was rather bemused by that, because I know from having seen you in action that the creative arts are not a million miles from your talents and interests, and I know you believe that they should be exploited in language teaching, which perhaps we can, obviously you may want to pick up that strand when we get further down. But before I hand back to John to start about your first teaching job, what did you do between Cambridge and starting that job? I think you had a year out or 2 years out somewhere.
I had a year. So yes, there was a confusion about my year abroad. Normally you'd do that between your second and third year at university, but something went wrong with the paperwork. So I in fact did that after I'd got my degree. So after my third year, I went to Marseille for the year, and I worked with people who were studying for their CAPES or their agrégation. So I was working with very high level students rather than being in a school environment at that point. But I had already sort of gained interest in becoming a teacher when I'd been at school myself, but when I became a Sunday school teacher. My grandparents on my father's side were very involved in the chapel in the village they lived in the Potteries. And so I would go along when I went on holiday there in the summer. I would go along and help my grandma running that Sunday school, which I thought was very enjoyable, working with younger children and helping them to learn how to talk about things. Just, I don't know, it just something that appealed to me. So then back in Wolverhampton, I also started working with the Sunday school at my local church, where the woman who led it was a primary head teacher, and she was a brilliant teacher. I mean, she just opened my eyes to many things about how you encourage children to explore and discover things. So that was partly the reason why I thought about doing the teacher training, because I thought I would enjoy it, even if I didn't follow it up into a career. I would enjoy the year of training. And I made my decision about coming to Durham while I was in Marseille, because I was just looking for somewhere which had a nice cathedral that I hadn't visited. So I chose Durham. I chose York as well, but York was full. So I came to Durham, and I've lived in Durham ever since, because it's a lovely, lovely place.
Yeah, it is.
I still go to the cathedral most weeks.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. John, would you like to resume where I interrupted?
Yes. Well, yeah, Durham for me is a special place too, because I did my postgraduate studies there with Mike. So very special indeed. So you went to, was it Belmont School you went to in Durham when you started teaching?
Yes. So my teacher training was, again, not particularly orthodox, because, as I said, I was interested in working with younger children. So I did my teacher training to work in middle schools, which were a thing in this part of the country at that time, and have since more or less withered away. So I was training to be teaching across the curriculum, children aged 9 to 13, that sort of age group. And that was going to be my plan. And then I thought, well, as there aren't any middle schools actually near here, and I want to stay here, maybe I shall be a primary teacher. And then it happened that the head teacher at Belmont Comprehensive School rang my tutor and said, you don't happen to have anyone who has French, because we need a French teacher. So I ended up going to Belmont, and I stayed there for 13 years.
Right. Yes, I know all about middle schools. I had all my teaching career in a middle school.
Yeah.
So the 9 to 13 age group, nice group to work with.
Exactly so.
And also middle schools, yes, are now sort of collapsing all around. We still have them up here in Northumberland, but they have a deadline. So what happened next after that? So then things changed after the 13 years.
So those 13 years were very well. I enjoyed them, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have stayed there for all that time. But they were, in a way, I felt a little bit isolated, because at the time I didn't know anything about the opportunities to meet other teachers. I didn't know there were such things as conferences, anything like that. I just thought I was supposed to get on with my class in my classroom, and that was how it was to be. So when I joined the school, it was just after the comprehensive school system had come into place in this part of the world. So it was a brand new school formed of 2 secondary modern schools, which were quite close to each other. So some of the students had done some French before, and some of them hadn't. And my job, so I was part-time when I joined, and my head of department was also part-time. Those were the only 2 of us doing French. And we were hardly ever in school at the same time. And if we were, then we were both teaching. So we didn't really have time to talk about very much. But my job when I went to be interviewed by the head teacher was, he put it, that he wanted us to interest the pupils, all of them, in a language. He wanted as many people as possible learning a language in Key Stage 3. It wasn't called that at the time, but in those years, definitely. And then he wanted nearly everyone to be taking a language in what's now Key Stage 4 and taking an exam at the end of it. So I had a change of head of department after 2 years, because the first one started a family. And so my new head of department suggested we also introduce German. So in the first 5 years of teaching, we managed to get everyone in Key Stage 3 doing French, and then about half of them also doing German in year 8 and 9. And then in the following year, we had something like 90% of them doing one or the other of the languages or both for the O-level or the CSE at the time, but soon the GCSE. So that was a big development, and it was a big learning curve, but it was an exciting time. We were also introducing school visits and graded objectives and all those sorts of things. So it was non-stop, but it was exciting in its way.
What would you say were the main factors, Stephen, in you achieving that quite remarkable success in take-up? You must have done something to fire them up.
Well, I think it was, well, part of the thing was we had a course book. We'd been bequeathed a course book that was in the school when I arrived, but we didn't really like it. Well, I didn't like it anyway. So most of the resources that we used in my lessons, and I think it was the same in Jane's lessons at the beginning, were things that we were making ourselves. So it was quite personalized, you'd say nowadays. You were thinking about your class, thinking about differentiating for that class, thinking about things that would get them into the idea of learning a language to begin with, because right up here, and even worse for where John is, I guess, we're so far away from the channel crossings and so on, that a lot of people would never even think about going across the channel to visit a place or anything like that. So trying to encourage village children to think about going further than Durham was quite a challenge for them, and meeting people from another country who spoke another language. We had to find lots of strategies for drawing them into the activities we'd planned to help them understand and respond to the language we were trying to teach them, and interest them in the culture of the place as well. So I think it was just necessity. And also the background of having done middle school training meant I was thinking more about, we'd had to read Piaget and everything like that, obviously. So I was thinking more about the individual pupils and not just thinking about the content of the course, but the way that they would cope with it.
Could I just ask you about the nature of the school's intake? You said village.
Yeah.
I lived briefly in the northeast. I don't know it very well, but I know it's a mixture. There's a rural northeast and there's the industrial northeast, and there's bits in between. What sort of mix did you have in the school?
Yes, well, the city of Durham is very small. It's like in a way, it's a small town or a very, very big village, I suppose. But it's surrounded by other villages which have in the past had their own pits in them, coal mines in them. So a lot of those are now drawn into what is now the modern city, although they are a mile or two away from the cathedral, with countryside in between them and main roads and so on. So Belmont had its catchment from Belmont, which is an estate on the edge of the city, and then mining villages further afield, such as Sherburn and Pittington and West Rainton. Those were the three main drawing points, but people came from other villages even further away up in the Wear Valley.
Okay, thank you. Sound a bit like the area where I grew up elsewhere, but we're not here to talk about me. So, John, would you like to pick up the next stage of Stephen's career with him?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, John, you'd asked about what happened at the end of the 13 years. So
next bit, yes.
Yes. So in that 13th year, this was when I understood there were other people around the country who were doing the same job as me, and that they had things to share with me and with other language teachers, and vice versa, because we got involved in a project which was funded by the Employment Department, or Department of the Employment, I think it was called, something like that. They'd launched a project called TVEI, which we'd heard about, which was the Technical and Vocational Education Initiative. And the Employment Department were funding a project called Flexible Learning in the Northeast. And so this brought together schools from around the area, languages teachers from those schools, to develop resources which were about treating older teenagers a bit more as adults than as children, giving them perspectives into how you could use languages professionally or in different careers, and making the language more relevant. At that time, that meant often slightly transactional, so useful language in practical communication situations, and so on, and broadening their interest, basically. So I was nominated to be the person from our school who was involved in this project. And this was when I met people from other schools, not just even schools in Durham, but schools in Sunderland, Newcastle, Northumberland, and Teesside. They all came together at these things called conferences that I'd never conceived of as before. So this was like, it was a real empowerment, because they were asking us questions that I'd been thinking about, but not realizing that other people were asking the same questions, and exchanging ideas on planning for independent learning. Autonomy was a big thing at the time in language learning. It was a very new and exciting for me way into thinking about planning the curriculum. At the time, we didn't have schemes of work or anything like that. We just planned our own lessons according to what we knew had to be delivered, loosely based on the textbook that we had at the time. So this was all like, it was a liberation at the same time as being another demand on your time and planning.
Wow, yes. So that obviously was a real dramatic change.
Yeah.
And then that led to other things through these contacts and this experience.
Exactly. So I discovered the conferences, and we were taken, because there was quite a lot of funding in this project. So they took us to national events. They took us to a SILT conference. I'd never heard of SILT at that time, the Centre for Information on Language Teaching and Research, sadly no longer with us. They took us to one down in the Midlands, the South Midlands somewhere, about autonomy, which was a weekend conference, amazing experience, where I met people like Brian Page and Barry Jones and Anne Swarbrick, and Alan might have been at that conference as well, actually, I think. Were you there, Alan, at the one, not Milton Keynes, but somewhere around there?
Possibly.
Yeah. So, and all of these people were saying things in front of me, and I was thinking, yes, that's what I think, or yes, I can respond to that. All these things were happening. So, so yes, it was partly meeting those people and partly going to those places, and also my first experience, I guess, of speaking to other teachers. In my school, I was quite shy as a speaker. I was okay in my classroom, but talking in staff meetings, I didn't do that very much, because I was one of the younger teachers, and I just thought it's not my role to speak in the staff meetings. But here at these events, people were asking me to talk about the work we were doing and describe things and so on and so on. And I found that that I could do it, and that other people enjoyed listening to me. So that was, again, a bit of a surprise, but very, very nice. So because of that project, I met the language advisor in the county. And when the following year they were looking for what we'd call an advisory teacher, they called it a curriculum support teacher at the time, he suggested I should apply for that as a secondment, which I did. So I held that post for 3 years, working in a lot of the schools in the county, not primary schools, because primary languages wasn't on the horizon at that point, but mainstream secondary schools and special schools I worked with for those 3 years, working on curriculum development in their classrooms, as well as on CPD for the teachers. And working, I have to say, as a major moment of learning and transformation, probably for me in my classroom practice, was working in those special schools with these amazing teachers of children with moderate, severe, or profound learning difficulties, who really showed me that you have to think about taking things in the tiniest steps. You have to predict any possible misunderstanding and just guide people in the right way, and not expect them to remember very much from one lesson to the next, which is the same in mainstream as well, of course. So that was a revelation to me, all of that sort of work. So then I'm just wandering on by myself now, John.
But no, that's good.
So after this was a 2-year secondment, and then they wanted me to do a 3rd year, and I wanted to do it. So at that point, I had to resign from my teaching post to do that. And at the end of the 3rd year, that was when my advisor showed me the advertisement for the job at the BBC, which he said I should apply for, and again, which I applied for and was successful once again. And that's how I ended up in BBC Languages, which was a crossover department between languages. So there were people in the department who did languages for adults, languages for older people, and languages for business. And there was me doing languages for schools, and that overlapped with the schools department, where there were people in all the other curriculum areas doing resources for children learning at school as well.
When you were teaching, did you draw on the BBC materials that existed before you went there?
I did a little bit. I had a bad experience with BBC programs during my 2nd teaching practice. So before I started being a full-time languages teacher, in that the primary school had set me up. They always watched this program, which was about nature, natural history. They always watched it. You had to take the children into the hall where the television was. They sat down in front of the TV and you watched this. So you needed to prepare the lesson. You needed to be prepared to follow up whatever was on the program. So the one I was going to watch was about the, what was it called? The land crab. It was a type of crab anyway. So I'd prepared myself. I'd learned how to draw a diagram of this crab, describe all the parts of its body, where it lived, what it ate, and everything. I had my board ready. You know how you could roll your board around at the time? So I'd drawn my crab and rolled it round so it was ready for when we came back from watching the program. We went to watch the program, and there was the usual announcement: in a change of programming, we are not bringing you the land crab. Today we are bringing you the Rose Bay willow herb. So I had to listen harder than the children did to the program to try and pick out something about the Rose Bay willow herb.
So despite that trauma, you still went to the BBC.
I did, because by then they'd started making targeted programs for Key Stage 3. They hadn't done anything for Key Stage 4 at that point. 15 Minutes was the first one that became a great success and was used by schools all over the country.
What kind of year was this? What
So
sort of
this
year
would be 1993.
Right.
So then, yes, so I worked there for 15 years, and we made a lot of radio, television, and print resources. And it was the beginning of when the internet became available. So I was in the generation that created the BBC Bite Size project, which is still going nowadays for GCSE.
Right.
I think I missed my cue there. So if John's about to say something, I'll let John.
No, you go ahead. Have you got a point you want to come in here? I was
simply on the BBC.
Yeah.
The BBC obviously had a strong record in language programs for adults, which it goes back far further, as you know, as well as I know. Was there how much scope was there for mutual reinforcement between the experience being developed in that area and what you were called upon to develop for the national curriculum years?
It was interesting because obviously the people I was working with, the directors and the producers of the television, say, for example, were often very experienced and had been producing successful materials, often for adults, as you say, beforehand. So they had a sort of idée fixe about what it was they were going to be doing. And so part of my job was to be very diplomatically saying to them, yes, but we need to think as well about the language level as well as the cognitive level of the learners, because adults can do things that teenagers won't. refused to do, and so on. So there were some people who responded very well to that and who realized what I was saying, and others who were saying, well, I've always done it like this. And I was saying, but maybe you need to try and think about a slightly different way of doing it. Obviously, anything to do with the cultural background or filming in the other country, that they produced amazing images and scenes, but they didn't always think about giving the speakers support in how to deliver when they were talking in the target language. They wanted spontaneous and natural sounding language, but sometimes they never said, can you just speak a little more slowly than your natural speed? Because this is for 12-year-olds who are going to be listening, and they won't have the skill to be able to break it all up and understand the separate words unless you talk a bit more slowly than normal.
Before we move on from the BBC, John, you wanted to come in on that, or was it something else?
Well, I would have to pick up the phrase you said that teenagers refuse to do.
Yeah.
Which opens up the interesting business of motivation with kids. And you would have had in Belmont already the experience of kids from very different backgrounds.
Yeah.
But obviously you were motivating them to the point where you got them to do languages and everything.
Yes. So how did we do that? I think it's partly about it wasn't a huge school. We were a sixth form entry most of the time. Occasionally there was an extra class. So you could get to know them quite well. And there were just things about them that you could latch on to. You knew that if you tried to get them to sing a song, they wouldn't do it probably at first time round, certainly. But if you played them a song, then some people would start to join in. Or if I sang a song, then they'd all laugh at me, and then they'd be all right, and they would start to join in with the song because they knew they couldn't do it worse than I did. So it was about building relationships with them, so they felt that if they had a go at something, no one was going to disparage them. People might laugh, but they were laughing along with them because we were all playing the same game.
Yeah. And did you had a middle school training?
Yes.
Did that help because it was a wider view of language teaching and everything?
I think it did, because it was all about being child-centered. So I was really observing how they were responding and seeing the groups who were actually waiting for more. They wanted to go faster, and the ones that actually were saying it's going a bit fast for me, or weren't really quite engaging with it in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, this is my turn. The other one, I mean, all that is totally fascinating. I think the BBC, working with them and having that kind of experience was absolutely amazing. And obviously you achieved all. And the business of needing to be diplomatic and persuading people who don't really understand, who would have some language but couldn't deliver it to the level and whatever.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask something about the primary French element.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, how do you see that? I'm not quite sure what's happening now. I mean, I was involved as a teacher, but where are we with that kind of thing now? And from the BBC, you were doing with younger children things as well, were you?
So we weren't making resources for primary languages until the last few years when I was there, which was when it was there was a lot of development going on around the country, managed largely by the people from SILT and their local groups around the country, working with the local language advisors as well.
Yeah.
That was before it became statutory, of course. That wasn't until 2014. So we did make some things on television as well as on the internet. And the issue at that time was trying to maintain the variety of languages that were being offered at primary, because it was one of our aspirations. We didn't want to narrow things down. That was the BBC's policy. They wanted to be more broadening things out. So they didn't want to just do something in French, even though French was very much the dominant language in primary at that time. So we did do things for French and for German and for Spanish. And we did one thing for Arabic and a thing for Japanese at one point as well. But the nature of them was very much, so what they weren't online courses by any means. They were things which would supplement what the teacher wanted to do. So we didn't want to take anything away from the teacher. We wanted to give them extra things. So, for example, there would always be a song in. I would insist on there being a song in, because a song is quite, if you write it carefully, it can have some very useful language in it. It can focus on all of the sound system of the language, obviously, when you're doing a song, but it can also encapsulate pieces of grammar that you really want the pupils to be remembering. So, like, for instance, very useful verbs, high frequency verbs, or phrases like, I would like something, asking for things in the shop, and so on. So we would always include those sorts of things. The other thing that they really was special about them was all of the cultural content, because most of them would have film from one of the target language countries. So we would be seeing real people speaking that language in a real context, which is obviously beneficial to teachers all over the country who may not be native speakers, but most of them aren't, and who wouldn't otherwise have access to that sort of image.
That sounds really, really good. It's not something I was aware of at all, but I by that time I wasn't doing so much of the primary, the years 7 and 8 and things.
Yeah.
Stephen, can I ask? I know you were centrally involved in the language magician development. Would you like to tell us a bit about that, and how you came to be involved in that, and what you? I know the funding ended for that kind of thing, but what were the positives and the possibilities maybe that haven't come to fruition for extraneous reasons, shall we say?
So yes, it was a great project, and it all came about through my engagement with ALL. So I joined ALL in 1990, which was the year when the world opened up for me, which was also the year that ALL was founded. And I became, because my advisor told me I became the local secretary for the ALL branch in the Northeast back in 1990. So I've been working with them ever since. I've been a volunteer for ALL ever since 1990 in various different roles. And one of the things that came along after the millennium, so probably about 2012, something like that, it might have started, were the Erasmus Plus projects, which had previously had other names in the European Actions. But by this time, they were drawn together under Erasmus Plus. And the Language Magician was one of those. So I volunteered to be involved in it because Carl Pfeiffer asked me if I would. So Carl was our colleague at the Goethe Institute, and they were leading this project. And I'd worked with him on television programs when I was at the BBC. I'd now left by this time. So, but he'd said, Stephen, would you like to work on this? Because I think you'd enjoy it and your experience will fit with what we want to do. So the project was to make an online game for primary children learning languages. And we were making it to begin with in French, German, Spanish, English. I think that was it the first time round. And then they've added another language or two to it since then. And the idea was it would be a game. That's what the children see it. But it would be a game that would capture some data about how they were doing, how they could cope with the questions inside the game. So it was a game based on challenges in which the player takes on the role of a language magician, and they have to try to defeat the bad magician who has captured all of the magic animals from the magic farm. So you have to go into with the magician's tower and release them by doing language challenges on the way up the tower. And as if by magic, on the ground floor, the challenges are all to do with reading. And on the first floor, they're to do with listening. And then on the third floor, they're mixed skills. On the fourth floor, they're writing, and so on and so on. So all of those floors, you play your game, you're answering little multiple choice questions or drag and drop questions. And the algorithm is collecting information about how many things you get right first time or second time, any you don't get right, how long you take over these things. And some of the challenges were about solving problems. We weren't expecting everyone to know all the vocabulary in there, but could they work out, by elimination or whatever, what the correct answer might be. And at the end of it, they would all get individually a certificate saying how brilliantly they had done, especially and it would tell them on the first floor, you got 90% of the questions right, or whatever it might be. And if they had got to the top of the tower, which they rarely did on the first playing of the game, and defeated the evil magician, then they got a special certificate with a hat on it, a magician's hat, to show how powerful they were. So it was a lovely thing to work on. And the amazing thing about those projects was you would meet with these people who you didn't know previously, and you would just recognize them straight away. You'd start a conversation and you'd just hear your own ideas coming back at you. I remember the people from Tenerife in particular, we just seemed to understand each other from the first hour of being together in the room. So then that sort of professional link and professional friendship is something that I think is very special in language teaching profession. I'm not sure that comes across so much in other parts of the curriculum, but language teachers from all over the world just understand each other very, very quickly.
I think it's true to say, sorry.
No, go on, John.
I was just going to say quickly that language teachers tend to feel quite isolated within schools, don't they? They're a bit different. What they're doing is not the same as what's happening in other areas.
Very, very much so. And nowadays, even more so than back then, because now departments are often smaller, and sometimes there's only one language, so you're not getting the same cross fertilization that you had before.
Yeah.
And that's something that, again, through ALL, we try to address by creating, nowadays, since all the experiences of the lockdown, we organize a lot of meetings online, like the one we're in at the moment, just so people can get together and talk to each other, even though they're not in the same room.
Yeah.
Could we could we move on, Stephen? One of the sections we've got here was language teaching in the UK, obviously specifically England we're talking about.
Yeah.
About here. It'd be very interesting to have your perceptions from your position in ALL and as an interested individual and in whatever capacity on where you think we're at and where do you think we're going in languages in schools.
Yeah. So one of the things that really empowered me back in that 1990 year when I was beginning to explore outside my classroom was the launching of the national curriculum. In that year, in 1990, when I went to the ALL Language World Conference, there were copies of the final advice for languages on the national curriculum for everyone to take away. And it was a green book. I'm sure you probably have a copy of it, all of you, somewhere on your shelves. I thought that book was amazing because it was either confirming so many things that I had been thinking, or it was suggesting things that I had never thought of that were eye-opening, basically. That document was something I carried with me for a long time. And in those years from 1990 up until not quite the millennium, were, I thought, a high point for language teachers, because there was all of these issues to be discussed and explored, and then solutions to be found to fit the context of the different schools, because they're all slightly different from each other, and the classrooms are different from each other. So that was at the time when Key Stage 3 and 4 languages were statutory. And as we know, Key Stage 4 then became non-statutory at a time when we were developing the National Languages Strategy, which seemed to be deeply ironic somehow. So they were exciting times because there was such a lot to talk about, and there was time and funding to support people in doing the talking. There were many people, many different agencies who were supporting events and publications for teachers to support them in their reflection, which again have now been removed largely from political reasons. So that sort of thing is much harder to do nowadays. at that time, when I was meeting people as well through ALL from other countries and from all around this country and from Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, it felt as though the UK was quite forward-thinking, quite dynamic in its reflection on teaching and learning, especially within the context of languages, talking about issues like grammar and progression and self-confidence and autonomy in sort of big headings for things we were aspiring to. Languages for life, which was one of the mottos of SILT, of course. All of those things seem to be going in a very positive and constructive direction, which have since been eroded, to my mind, by the way things have happened in usually in the politics that go around education and decisions about schools. So that in those days, if you met someone from another country and you said you were from the UK, they'd say, oh, that's interesting because I've been reading this, or they'd talk about something that was going on. And you'd feel as though our thinking about communicative education and things like that was quite ahead of the game. Whereas nowadays we have our knowledge curriculum, obviously, in that with our current government, and we feel as though, well, I feel as though we've gone back 40 years or so, and we're rediscovering things we'd forgotten we used to do, but we're also forgetting those things that we had developed in the interim that we always thought were successful. So it seems it's a little bit of a darker time, I would say, now for languages than it was back then. Even though we now have statutory primary languages, we have them with no funding or training available for the teachers, or time available for the teachers who are delivering it. So it's a hard slog, I think.
Yeah, I remember in the mid-1990s going to the Council of Europe Modern Languages meeting in Strasbourg, and people from across Europe used to stop me and ask me if I got any spare copies of the national curriculum document with me. I mean, one colleague from one of the Baltic states almost had tears in her eyes because I gave her a national curriculum document.
Yes.
But I say, we're not here to talk about me, but I can see that there are things that we chime with and reinforce each other. You talked about, obviously, it's not just about money, but money obviously helps. I mean, TVEI was a positive experience for you, and obviously working with people in LEA was a positive experience, and the networking you got from SILT and so on was a positive experience. Do you think the erosion or demise of these things, that puts an even greater responsibility on ALL? I ought to say in full for anyone from abroad who gets this recording, the Association for Language Learning. But it would seem to me that you're the major networking agency that survives in this. So.
Yes. So, I mean, the short answer would be yes, because people now, even when I meet people either in person or online, people are still bemoaning the loss of all of the web resources that were created by SILT, for example, which seemed to go somewhere when everything was closed down under our coalition government. And people find them very hard to locate nowadays. And they bemoan the fact that we don't have that network of the primary support people all around the country who were working with teachers and bringing things together in the way that local authorities did so well. So ALL has, obviously, because we're not dependent on the government, we're a charity and we're funded by our membership, we have been able to weather that storm in a way. It's created a great deal of work for us, and we are very fortunate in having very many committed volunteers who run things for the association, for their local teachers, or on national groups, on different language groups, whatever it might be. And they are, as a community, language teachers are amazingly generous in their sharing of resources and ideas when we have meetings or webinars, whatever it might be. And by providing resources to share on the website as well. So that's all very positive, but it's also very fragile because, as I say, at the moment we have a lot of committed volunteers, but younger teachers don't join associations in the same way as my generation did. So the sustainability is always a bit of a risk for us.
I got another line of questions, but John, is there anything you want to pick up what Stephen has said while I've been having my dialogue with him?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's lots of points that I think are absolutely fascinating. I think I would be one thing I would perhaps ask is the place of spoken language in the national curriculum now, with all the testing and things, that it does seem that it's easier to do the other parts of the attainment levels and skills rather than doing stuff on the spoken language. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
I think it is. I think that's a very precise observation. I think there's many reasons for it. I think it's something to be regretted. We've just done a crowdsourced publication on the AWL website about speaking called It's Good to Talk, which is just trying to raise the issues of why we have so much talking and how important it is, not just for the language practice and for revisiting the vocabulary that you use when you speak, and so on, but also as part of learning, because talking is often the basis of how we begin to explore the grammar as well, and the way we put sentences together and what's appropriate responses and so on. But the issues around speaking in schools are complicated by the policies of, now that we have these enormous organizations called things like multi-academy trusts, where they have one policy that goes across all of their schools. And some of those trusts have a policy of silent classrooms, for example. So they don't want to have students talking, even if they're talking in another language. It's frowned on, as it were. And if you're in a school where you're not supposed to do any talking in the corridor, and the teacher asks you to do some talking, you're going to think, is this a trap? Are they trying to set me up for some sort of punishment here? So that's an issue, obviously. Plus, the other aspect is the current obsession with exam results and grades means that a lot of our brighter students are shy about talking because they don't want to say anything wrong. They don't want to have a bad mark. So they both of those things conspire against it. But obviously, one of our key roles in a languages classroom as teachers is to be exposing our class to the target language. So they've got to hear us talking. And then the only natural thing, if you're in any measure interacting with your class, is to get them to talk back to you, surely.
Yes, absolutely, definitely.
Stephen, we've been going for nearly about an hour, and I'm sure we could go on for much longer. The final section we were going to talk about and are going to talk about is the international dimension and contact with other countries and language teaching in other countries. Now, the way the conversation's involved, we've touched on many of these things already, but I think there are two aspects of the international thing in your case. Your own personal experience with what you have referred to elsewhere as your French family.
Mm-hmm.
I think people who don't know about how that evolved would be very interested, because it was a major influence in motivating you, and some of the more informal contacts that you've had with colleagues abroad. So it's open-ended. Anything you want to say on those things?
Yeah, so I just had a memory came into my mind as well, Alan, of when I was a teacher at Belmont, and when we got the BBC computer, which was a big thing. So this was in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And there was a thing on it which was the sort of the first experimentation with what we now call email. There was a thing where you could write a message into a word processor document on the computer, and then you had to put it onto a floppy disk, which were great big 6-inch square discs at the time, which you then put into a different machine, and you had to spool it. You had to push a button and it would spool it. I don't know what it meant, but it seemed to put it onto an audio tape of some sort. And then that was what you pressed another button and it would send that to an address somewhere else, and they would receive your words. It was like magic at the time, but it was a bit laborious. But it was a way of getting people, of getting the students in touch with people in another country. I remember we did a collaborative poem writing activity. It would have been in 1989, I guess, where they were writing, the start of each line of the poem was something like, it wasn't "I remember," it was something about "what makes me happy is," something like that. And then they were writing the end of the line and then sending it off to pupils across the channel and getting them to write the end of the line and send it back to them. But yes, in-person contact is the other thing. So yes, through my work at BBC and in ALL, I've been able to meet a lot of people from other countries and work with them on lots of different projects, nearly all of which have been really enjoyable. I don't know why I'm saying nearly all. I can't remember any that went really wrong. But a lot of that, as Alan says, is based on my own experience when I was a teenager. So when I moved from Leamington, I was in the Scouts at school, and we did have a summer camp the year I moved, which was an Amicaro, which is an international Scout meeting, and it was at Packwood Park near Coventry. So there were thousands of Scouts, it seemed to me, from all over the world, and they produced a magazine every day in multiple languages. I mean, well ahead of its time, a multilingual magazine back in 1968. And we were twinned with Scouts from Luxembourg. So I was able to speak to them in French and in German and in Latin, all of which I did because those were my 3 languages at the time. And then we went back to stay with them the following summer. They came at Easter time, I think it was. We went in the summer. And again, so in Luxembourg, obviously, they are trilingual, so I could speak all of my languages. Nobody wanted to speak English, so that was fine. I liked that. So I enjoyed that experience. So when my teacher later on asked about doing an exchange, this was my French teacher, and she was very, very pro going to France and enjoying France and how wonderful France was. She talked me into it before she opened her mouth, basically. So I was twinned with Jean-Marc, his father worked for the railways. And so the system was that Jean-Marc came to stay with me, first of all, in Wolverhampton. Obviously, French term finished sooner than ours did, so he came while I was still at school. I didn't want to stop going to school. He didn't want to go to school, so he spent most of his days with my mother, making her life a misery because he was bored in the house. Anyway, so that was Jean-Marc, who I first met in 1970, and then who I was very, very close to for all the rest of his life. He sadly died in 2021. But so every year since 1970, I have been to stay in his family. So first of all with his parents, and then with him or with his sister or with one of his children. And the 3 children are my godchildren. Their children are now in this world as well. So I've known 5 generations of this family, into which I am pretty well integrated. So if there's a party, you can't have a party without Stephen, which is very nice. So I still see them. I go over half a dozen times a year and spend time with different members of the family. And they've been over to stay over here as well many times during the years, which is also eye-opening, introducing them to my friends in Durham who might not otherwise be in contact with people from Europe. They've always enjoyed each other's company. And it just makes everything fit together, really, because you think, well, the language is there to help build the bridges, but it's the personalities that actually do the building of those bridges. So yes, so getting to know other people and building those friendships and relationships is I think it's an important part of life, and it's something that certainly has enhanced all of my life, all of those years, because I'm older than 17 now, in case you hadn't worked that out.
Mhm. Even you.
Even me, yes.
It's a very positive note, Stephen. John, do you want to come in and ask Stephen anything before we wrap
Well,
it up?
I think we've covered, as they say, wide-ranging conversation. I think it's absolutely fascinating what we've heard, and I think most of the questions I would have wanted to ask, have either been answered already or have been covered. I think it's been a very, very positive session.
Good, thank you.
So the final question, Stephen, I promised you is there a question if we'd been asking you the question you would like to have asked yourself?
Yes, so I think there are two. So one is about memory. So this project that you're managing at the moment is sort of trying to draw on memory of people who've been around for a little while, about what's been going on in language teaching, which I think is an admirable idea. Because as I say, I still meet teachers all of the time at ALL events. We had a council meeting just on Saturday, and they're talking about issues. And I'm thinking, oh, yes, I remember talking about this back in the 1990s. But of course, they don't know that because they weren't teachers at that time. And it's very hard to try to maintain a professional memory that we can just go back to. So people like Barry Jones and Brian Page and Eric Hawkins, they were in an era when they would write. So their writing is still around, and that's a fantastic thing. But nowadays, it seems to be more, you've got to be on film, you've got to make a little film like this one to try to conserve the nature of what someone was talking about. So yes, that's a challenge for us as a profession, I think, not to think everything is new when it comes along, when there's a change, but try to look back and see if there is advice somewhere in the paperwork. And the other question I was going to, the answer I wanted to put in was if I had concerns in particular about what was going on just at the moment. And I think the big change from when I started teaching until now is the erosion of a teacher's agency. Because when I was, as I said earlier on, when I was first teaching, we had to do everything. Every day we planned for the next day, and it was all purpose made and fitted with the class and so on. Whereas nowadays, some teachers are losing the skill of planning lessons or planning a scheme of work because they're in an establishment that doesn't require that, where the trust, for example, will give them the resources that will be used across all of their schools for teaching whatever the subject might be, but say a language. So they have lost that that empowerment to personalize things and find their own resources, because obviously they're in the lesson, they're limited by time. So I think that's the thing that worries me about that is partly the loss of the skill set, identifying the resources and then identifying what you can do with them, but also the threat to professional satisfaction, because when you were doing that, you were worn out doing it, but if it went well, you felt really good about it. And we know that teachers are leaving the profession in languages as much as anything else. So I just worry that we're taking away some of the enjoyment that a teacher might have in their classroom by that development, which is not in our control. But we do need to remind our teachers and our members in ALL, for example, of the principles of being a language teacher, which they probably had when they did their teacher training, and which might have been eroded by the everyday life at the chalk face, as they say.
Right. Thank you for that. It underlines how important it is that ALL carries on doing its work, and thank you again. I am, of course, an ALL member myself. Thank you for all you've invested in that over the years to keep it going. And I think there are many positives in the things it's trying to do. But that would be for another interview with someone else in 20 years' time, maybe.
Yes, look
So
forward.
thank you, and we'll leave it there for now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.